Warning, this video contains spoilers, and viewer discretion is advised. This is not for babies or cowards. You've been warned. Seriously, like for real.
Hello Jamie, it's me, Turbo Man. Now it's time to sit still and pay very good attention because I am back for one more episode of the series where we cover the very best and very most interesting Turbografx-16 video games. Yeah, that's right Jamie, it's Turbo time!
Okay, I'll take it from here, Turbo Man. The game we will be covering today is none other than... Whoa, what the f*** is that?
Sorry, dude, but the following game may be inappropriate for young children and cowards.
What? Are you serious, Brad?
Sorry, dude, but it says so right on the box. Not for little kids, and not for cowards. So if you have a Nintendo Entertainment System, then I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to leave now. But if you play the Sega Genesis or Turbografx-16, or if you're a decorated member of the armed services, or in a heavy metal band, then by all means, rock on, dudes!
Alrighty then. So if you're still here, and in case you didn't read the title of the video, today's game is Splatterhouse. Splatterhouse was developed by Namco, and according to the internet, was originally released to the arcades in November of 1988. However, also according to the internet, that bastion of unverified knowledge and questionable truth, Splatterhouse the arcade game was supposedly banned in the United States for being incredibly gory, violent, and all around just way too bloody. This then supposedly led to a mere 100 PCBs ever being produced, making the game ultra rare. However, we at the CCP have never been able to find any evidence corroborating this story. And indeed, some of us around here are old enough to remember actually playing Splatterhouse at the arcades back in the late 80s. Not only does the game not seem to be all that rare, but it didn't really draw much controversy, sitting there beside such games as Golden Axe, Ghouls and Ghosts, or the seminal Data East classic, RoboCop. No, despite featuring an obvious mock-up of Jason Voorhees as the protagonist, grotesque backgrounds, numerous beheadings of deformed creatures, and copious amounts of green blood, as far as we can tell, no one was really actually outraged by the release of Splatterhouse. Indeed, it would be almost another 4 full years until the arcade release of Mortal Kombat, with its own graphic depictions of stupid ways to die in a karate tournament, and more than 5 years before career politician Joseph Lieberman would make violent video games the focus of the Senate Judiciary Committee in December of 1993. The same Senate Judiciary Committee that would ultimately lead to the creation of the Entertainment Software Rating Board, the ESRB, and the adoption of the ESRB rating system for all video games sold in the United States. Since 1994, the North American video game industry has voluntarily self-regulated the sale of their games on the basis of its content. In a similar manner to the movie industry, an ESRB rating is featured on every single game sold in stores, indicating the game's suitability to various age groups. E is for everyone. This is for games like Mario, Mario Kart, Mario RPG, Super Mario Fighters, Mario Blocks, Yoshi's Mario Cookie, and Mario 64. This is basically the video game world's equivalent to the G rating for general audiences, but mostly babies. E10 Plus is for games that are meant for general audiences, but are also slightly cooler than Mario. These are games that might feature some comic violence, or an obliquely bad word like damn, or they might feature scary imagery such as graveyards, or women being kidnapped by demons. This is basically your PG rating. T is for teen. This would be most of your best Sega Genesis games. Games that are funny or feature crude humor about butts, a little bit of violence or foul language, but not quite enough to be totally awesome. T for teen is essentially the video game world's PG-13 rating. M is for mature, or ages 17 plus. These are all of your top tier awesome games like Grand Theft Auto and Mortal Kombat. Games that are so badass that you have to show ID to the store clerk as if you were buying a bottle of Jack Daniels and a pack of cigarettes. M is the video game world's R rating. And then there's AO, or adults only, which is the equivalent of the NC-17 rating at the movies. It's rare, and it means that not only do they card you if you want to buy it, but they will not allow you to buy a game at all if it's intended for a minor. But generally, AO is reserved for weirdo gambling games, or games that are really nothing more than interactive pornographic films. There has never been a game with an AO rating that wasn't anything more than a trashy cash grab, so let's just ignore it. The ESRB rating system, then, is effectively E, E10+, T, and M, and since 1994, every game sold in stores has featured one of these 4 labels on the box art, just in case consumers are worried about the game's potentially corrupting or soul-stealing content. And this is why the box art for the Turbografx-16 port of Splatterhouse is so freakishly interesting. According to Wikipedia, which is never wrong, but according to Wikipedia, Namco's home port of Splatterhouse was released for the Turbografx-16 in August of 1990. That's more than 3 years before Joseph Lieberman's Senate Judiciary Committee hearings on violent video games, and more than 4 years before the ESRB rating system was officially rolled out. And yet what's this we see? Yes, Splatterhouse for the Turbografx-16 has a self-imposed warning label right on the cover of the box, written within a splatter of red blood no less.
The horrifying theme of this game may be inappropriate for young children and cowards.
It could very well be that Splatterhouse for the Turbografx-16 featured the first ever parental warning for a video game. But the truth is that there was nothing official or binding about this statement. If anything, this was more of a dare intended to get kids interested in what may have appeared to be forbidden fruit. I mean, this is how in the late 80s, Freddy Krueger and Jason became some of the most popular characters for boys between the ages of 6 and 12. Despite the R rating, pretty much every little boy in America was a huge fan of slasher films. I think the marketing department at NEC in the United States knew exactly what they were doing when they labeled Splatterhouse this way. They were deliberately making this game more tantalizing to kids by making it appear as if it were not suitable for them. I mean, it's like a schoolyard dare. They even accuse you of potentially being a coward if you don't play it. They might as well have just added the words, "We double dog dare you."
Oh yeah? Yeah, I like double dog dare you.
Because that's what this label really is. It's a freaking dare. They dare you to play this game and prove that you're not just a scared little baby. But even though it wasn't really official or legally binding, I bet this warning sticker caused a lot of problems back in the summer and fall of 1990.
Cut him down quick, pay the man his wage. He makes paper to fuel the information age.
Excuse me.
Do 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 do.
I said excuse me.
Whoa, sorry dude. I wasn't expecting anyone this late. I've never had a customer at 9:45 at night.
9:47 to be precise. Listen, Bradley, we're in a bit of a hurry here. It's my special boy's birthday, and he's been wanting to get a new video card for his TurboGrafx game computer.
Oh, so what? Whoa, what is that?
Down, Jamie. Down, boy.
Ah, what in the world?
Bad Jamie. Go. You go and look at the nice shiny bicycles. Like a good boy. I'm sorry about that. Someone slipped a Hershey's chocolate bar into his feeding trough today. He's usually a really well-behaved boy.
Okay, dude.
Anyway, he wants a game called Splatterhouse. Do you have any copies of Splatterhouse in stock?
Oh, I think you mean Splatterhouse.
That's the one. We've been looking everywhere, but no one seems to carry these TurboGrafx games anymore. Do you all have it?
We do, but like, how old is, your son?
That's a good question. You know,
I'm not completely sure. I leave those sorts of details to my lab assist. I mean, his mother. She probably knows for sure. Jamie, how old are you? According to Jamie, he's about 8 years old. In people years.
I'm sorry, dude. You see, I do have Splatterhouse in stock, but I'm not sure that you want to buy it for your son?
What? Why ever not, Bradley? This is a free country. This is still the United States of America, isn't it?
Well, yeah, but there's a warning label.
The horrifying theme of this game may be inappropriate for young children and cowards. Cowards? I'm no coward, Bradley. No sirree. I did 2 tours of duty in Vietnam back in '71. I was a first lieutenant, military intelligence, stationed at a small village just outside of Da Nang. The jungles were absolutely teeming with Charlie. Linus and Lucy were there too. Booby traps were everywhere. They killed our dog. It was a living hell, Bradley, and I was hell's gatekeeper. My mission was to maintain relations with the local authorities, to keep the army well informed, and to weed out communists through a scientifically proven system of interrogation. Partner-in-law, King Zoe!
Come.
Why, you stupid bastards? Just let it go! Just let it go! Just let it go! Just let it go!
Whoa, dude, that's heavy. But don't you think 8 years old might be a little young for a game like this?
Whatever do you mean? What's wrong with the game Splatterhouse? It's made for children, right?
Like, maybe you should watch the rest of the video, dude.
Alright, but we're in a bit of a hurry, so please make it snappy. Alright, I'll do my best. Anyway, in its time and in its own way, Splatterhouse was a big deal for the Turbografx-16, and it has gone on to become one of the failed console's most important core titles. It may not have been enough to save Hudson Soft and NEC's floundering venture into the North American game market, but if you had a Turbografx in 1990, then there's no doubt that this game was going to be on your radar, and at the top of your Christmas list. If you could get past that wacky parental warning label, that is. I'm not sure, however, if this was marketing genius or just commercial suicide. Anyway, critics emphatically praised the game. Electronic Gaming Monthly, always a strong supporter of the Turbografx-16, gave Splatterhouse solid 8s across the board from 4 different reviewers in the magazine's 13th issue from August of 1990. Steve here loved the grotesque, mostly true to the arcade graphics. Ed praised the intense boss fights. Martin, on the other hand, loved the graphics and weapon-wielding violence. And finally, Sushi X, the pen name for Ken Williams, lamented the missing sound effects from the arcade, but he also praised Splatterhouse for its great look and for being close enough to the arcade original. And that closeness to the arcade original is to be expected, because as far as we can tell, comparing the game credits side by side, Splatterhouse on the Turbografx-16 was developed in-house by Namco with roughly the exact same development team that worked on the arcade version. Indeed, the chief director for Splatterhouse, for both the Turbografx-16 and the arcade version, was none other than Shigeru Yokoyama, a legendary game designer and producer from Namco, who's worked on such immensely popular and well-received titles as Galaga, Ridge Racer, Tales of Fantasia, and for about the last decade, the Super Smash Bros. Series for Nintendo.
Nice!
Comparing the Turbografx-16 port of Splatterhouse side by side with the arcade version, we can see that superficially they are very similar. The Turbografx-16 does an admirable job of handling large, detailed, and relatively well-animated sprites. However, upon closer examination, you'll soon notice that there are also less sprites on the screen, and that the foreground and background are far less populated and detailed compared to the arcade version. More noticeably, however, is the difference in sound quality, especially as it pertains to the sound effects. The arcade version provides a nice whack with every single swing of the 2x4. But in the Turbografx-16 version, the effect is muted. There are other digitized sounds missing from the game as well, but none really take away from the experience as much as the lack of a solid thud for these hits. But in 1990, for a home console, the Turbografx-16 version of Splatterhouse was still very impressive. At the time, the vast majority of gamers were still playing on the NES, and so Splatterhouse wasn't really being compared to the arcade as much as it was to similar games that were released for Nintendo's 8-bit system. The fall of 1990 saw the NES release of Castlevania III: Dracula's Curse, as well as A Nightmare on Elm Street. There is no doubt that in terms of depth and quality of gameplay, that Castlevania III is the best game here, but there's also simply no contest when it comes to which of these games looks the most impressive. Of course, the Sega Genesis was also around in the fall of 1990, though it had yet to find a large mainstream audience. But if I had to make a comparison, then I'd focus in on Sega's excellent port of Capcom's hit Strider, which was also released in the fall of 1990. Comparing Splatterhouse on the Turbografx-16 to Strider for the Genesis is a much more fair comparison. Both look, sound, and play great, and both are satisfying versions of arcade classics. I think your preferences here are a matter of subjective taste, and that both games represent solid attempts to replicate arcade games at home. Truly, 1990 was like living in the future. Speaking of the Sega Genesis and the future, it's interesting to note that while Splatterhouse is inarguably one of the Turbografx-16's most commercially important and iconic games, the series ultimately jumped ship over to the Sega Genesis in 1992, with the home console exclusive Splatterhouse 2, a game that might actually be better than the original. And despite being freaky and featuring a boss fight with a bloody fetus monster, it was also never mentioned by Congress, and nor did it ever seem to trigger much in the way of any sort of debate or social concern. Splatterhouse 3 would be released the following year, also exclusively for the Sega Genesis, and being the least fun Splatterhouse yet, it would be the last Splatterhouse game for roughly the next 17 years. But why did Namco release both Splatterhouse 2 and Splatterhouse 3 for the Sega Genesis in 1992 and 1993 respectively, and not for the Turbografx-16? This is especially odd when you consider the fact that Namco had been such a major contributor to the Turbografx-16 game library in the first place. In fact, quite a few great Turbografx-16 games were developed or published by Namco, especially in those first critical years after the console's launch. Dragon Spirit's one of the console's most important and most popular games, which was followed by Galaga 90, Final Lap Twin, Pac-Land, and Ordyne, all of which were released before Splatterhouse in 1990. And yet after Splatterhouse and the lackluster Bravo Man were both released in the fall of 1990, Namco stopped supporting the North American Turbografx-16 altogether, despite the fact that the console would continue publishing games well into 1993. I suppose the obvious reason for the switch over to Sega is the fact that the Turbografx-16 didn't do well in terms of sales. No one really seems to know for sure how many Turbografx-16s were actually purchased between 1989 and 1993, but it has been reported that NEC was never able to sell out their one and only batch of 750,000 consoles. The Sega Genesis, on the other hand, would go on to sell tens of millions of consoles. Given the chasm between the two consoles in terms of sales, the truth is, Namco really couldn't afford to do otherwise. But none of that changes the fact that Splatterhouse for the Turbografx-16, taken on its own merits, is a really fun game to play. Unless, of course, you're really squeamish or a coward.
I'm no coward. They don't give the Bronze Star and Purple Heart to cowards. Good gravy! What in the name of Ronald Reagan is that? Ah!
You play as some guy named Rick, who's going to an old abandoned house, for some reason, where a scientist mysteriously disappeared while doing horrifying experiments on the dead. So you know, he was probably funded by the NIH and World Health Organization. Anyway, things go very wrong when Rick gets mysteriously knocked out, and then your girlfriend, who is hanging out with you for some reason, is captured by horrible Japanese monsters. Luckily, when Rick wakes up, he has the aid of some sort of purple demon hockey mask that has more than a passing resemblance to the white hockey mask of Jason Voorhees from Friday the 13th. The mask gives Rick giant muscles and the strength that he needs to survive the Splatterhouse and save his girlfriend, or so he hopes. Splatterhouse is a good game, especially for its time. At its core, it's really a fairly rudimentary side-scrolling beat-em-up in the tradition of classic arcade games like Kung Fu or Vigilante. You do get the addition of a jump button, which makes the game a bit more dynamic, but other than a few obstacles to get over here and there really isn't much in the way of real platforming required. The controls, however, are in fact pretty darn tight, and the hitboxes on enemies are well placed. Splatterhouse, as the name suggests, is all about carnage. Rick has a few basic attacks. He has a powerful and fairly swift punch, achieved by tapping on the attack button. Jump and attack allow Rick to hit a handy flying kick. Duck and attack, and then Rick will do a low kick. Press down and jump, and Rick will do a Mega Man style sliding attack across the floor. Actually, the Mega Man slide didn't debut until Rockman 3 for the Famicom in September of 1990. If you recall, Splatterhouse originally came out in November of 1988, so if anything, Mega Man is actually doing a Splatterhouse slide, not the other way around. But no one remembers Splatterhouse for Rick's karate moves. No, the emphasis in this game is, rightly, on splatting, and the best way to do that is with a weapon. In the Turbografx-16 version, Rick has 3 weapons that are made available to him at various times throughout the game. The most memorable, of course, is the 2x4, which allows him to literally splat monsters against the wall in the background. If I'm being honest, being able to do this is 90% of the appeal of this game. Then as much as now. Rick can also wield a so-called golden meat cleaver, but unlike the arcade version, which allows Rick to freaking behead monsters as fast and ferocious as a French revolutionary, Liberté! It's really just a tool for battling a single boss in the game. And, similarly, there is the shotgun, which supplies 8 admittedly satisfying rounds of demon pulverizing power. It's really only good for one boss fight, but it's still pretty cool. The weapons are so much fun in Splatterhouse that really one of the only complaints I can levy at this game is the fact that there are so few of them, and they come into use for such a brief period of time. I suppose this is related to my other big complaint with Splatterhouse, which is that it's really kinda too short. Even by the standards of 1990, the entire game can be beaten in roughly 20 minutes, if you're a skilled player. But despite the brevity and simplicity of gameplay, Splatterhouse excels at surprises, which almost makes me lament talking about this part of the video. But then on the other hand, Splatterhouse is also well over 30 years old, and I'm assuming that if you're watching this, you've probably already been around the block more than once. Like, maybe even a lot more than once. Am I right, fellas? So without further ado, here are some of the crazy surprises that you can find in the Splatterhouse game that would have shocked players if they had seen the game for the first time back in 1990. First of all, being true to its name, Splatterhouse lets you splat monsters pretty much right off the bat. You get the 2x4 after only a few seconds of gameplay, and of course, the bursting green visual effect is absolutely disgusting. Though it would have been great if the sound effects were a little harder hitting. Then, apparently dead enemies hanging out in the background will start spewing green blood at you. Spikes start bursting out of the ground, and then bats! Well, I guess bats aren't really unexpected in these sorts of games. They were like in every video game back in the day. But soon you climb a ladder and are confronted with the first boss fight, except no one's home. It's just a room filled with a pustulating pile of bloody filth and a mutilated corpse hanging by its neck. You know, basic stuff. Then suddenly out of the pile emerges an endless barrage of colon-like parasites with razor-sharp teeth. There's a ton of them to fight, but just when you think you've cleared the level, the corpse bursts open and one more comes flying at ya. You know someone had to have screamed the first time that happened to them. Right, Jamie? Level 2 is basically more of the same, except you do find a wrench. I forgot about this wrench. And here's why. You throw it once, it kills one dude, and it's gone. So pick the 2x4 back up as soon as possible. Then bodies start dropping down out of the ceiling. But be careful, because if you hit them, they burst with green goo that can actually hurt you if you get too close or touch it. Drop down a ladder and then splash. It's a sewer level, and out of the murky sludge more monsters pop up, but so will spiked turtle shells that have to be jumped over in order to go forward. This is basically the depths of the platforming that we talked about earlier, but the best part of this section is the crazy music that keeps building in intensity. It sounds like you're working up to a heart attack, but it's just a ladder, which leads to what I think is one of the coolest boss fights ever. A room possessed by ghosts that want to kill you. Literally everything in the room is the enemy. The room shakes violently. Stuff starts flying off the shelves. The trick is to hit everything at just the right time to stay alive. Then the painting flies off the wall, you fight it, and the ghost is set free. But watch out, if you're not careful, the freaking chandelier will kill you, even after the battle's over. The next level starts off with a bang. You get the shotgun. If you're not careful crossing over this bridge, a giant hand will come out and grab you under and send you to yet another water level, robbing you of the awesome shotgun weapon in the process. You can't let that happen here. Working your way to the end of the stage, you find yet another shotgun and an incredible boss fight involving a monster with freaking chainsaws for arms. You thought Edward Scissorhands had issues. This poor dude's got chainsaws and a bag over his head. Thankfully, for his sake, after shooting him a bunch of times, he goes down pretty quickly. Then you gotta harpoon monsters with weapons that work in precisely the same fashion as the wrench earlier, though admittedly a lot cooler, and there's a cancer monster crawling on the floor, some easy platforming, until you get to a creepy hall of mirrors, which features a cool visual effect that mirrors your sprite. Then suddenly a doppelganger will burst through one of the mirrors, revealing a fight with yourself. It's awesome. This then leads to a Catholic church, the Golden Meat Cleaver, and yet another boss fight against Madballs? Yes, these are totally Madballs, a popular toy line from the 1980s that were really nothing more than a rubber bouncing ball with monstrous facial features. This made them clumsy to actually play with, but fun to collect. I had the Mummy and the Horned Cyclops thing. Madballs played into the theme of gross out toys for boys that could scare away girls, a marketing angle that was very popular from about the mid-80s until about the mid-90s. There were a lot of other examples of this, things like the Garbage Pail Kids, creepy crawlers, etc. Supposedly girls hated these things, which was supposed to enhance their appeal, but really, you could look at it as a kind of test. If she's not afraid of the Madball, then she's marriage material as far as I'm concerned. But what are Madballs doing here, in a Catholic church no less? This seems like a very weird boss fight, even for a game as weird as Splatterhouse. Well, this is as good a time as any to discuss the fact that the North American version of Splatterhouse for the Turbografx-16 was heavily censored. So despite that cringy fake parental warning label, even NEC of America thought there were some things that were too taboo to tangle with. The most obvious difference that everyone notices was Rick's mask. In the arcade version it was white, but now it's purple. Obviously this was to avoid accusations of copyright infringement against the Friday the 13th film franchise, which was still quite popular at the time. So this quick fix, while lame and undesirable, is quite understandable. The less obvious and far more egregious change, however, was this boss fight against the Madballs. In the arcade game, you still fight Madballs, only instead of just Madballs circling around a generic blue zombie face, you face an upside down cross, indicating that some unholy or demonic force has entered into this church, flipping the altar cross upside down in defiance of God. If you've ever been to a Catholic Mass, then you'll notice that they always place a cross on the altar. Indeed, having such a cross is a requirement of church law, because the Mass is intended to be a participation in the sacrificial death of Jesus Christ at Calvary, and the presence of the altar cross is supposed to be a visible expression of this. The arcade version's battle with the upside down cross inside the church is actually quite fun, and a bit easy, especially since you're given an axe to fight with. But what's fascinating is the fact that at the end of the level, in a game that has been unrelentingly doom and violence up to this point, you come upon the actual altar for which the altar cross was intended. Suddenly, light engulfs the room, peaceful organ music plays, and Rick stops for a moment of spiritual respite at the foot of the altar. You can plainly see a depiction of Jesus Christ crucified, and at the foot of the cross is a woman with a halo, most certainly the Virgin Mary. More subtly, you can see the shadow of a much larger cross being cast upon the floor of the sanctuary just off to the right of the screen. The shadow is being cast by a large crucifix that would be on the back wall of the church, which is where you would also find the tabernacle, which houses the consecrated bread for communion. Catholics believe that this comprises the actual physical and spiritual presence of Jesus Christ, whom they regard as God, which is why they kneel, bow, or genuflect toward this exact spot whenever they enter or leave a church. Is Rick stopping to pray? To Jesus Christ? In a Catholic church? Wildly, yes, it seems that this is the case. Well, not in the Turbografx-16 version. In the Turbografx-16 version, you fight in the nave of a church, but once you defeat all of the monster balls, with the golden meat cleaver I might add, you get a different image. Light still engulfs the church, and you do get peaceful organ music. But as the camera pans to the right, Rick stops in front of nothing. Nothing at all. He just stands there like a dope in an empty room, listening to the organ music, I guess. Although you can still see the candles meant for the altar just hovering awkwardly in the middle of the air. What's amazing is that the Japanese home port of Splatterhouse for the PC Engine, which is almost the exact same game published by Namco, not only keeps Rick's white hockey mask, but it also retains the upside down cross boss fight from the arcade game. And when the battle is finally over, you get to the exact same scene, only this time the altar is fully intact, and there's even that shadow of the cross falling over the sanctuary, where the tabernacle would be. So in the PC Engine version, it's clear, as in the arcade version, that Rick is stopping for a moment of religious meditation and reflection, Catholic meditation and reflection. This is quite surprising, and it makes us wonder whether or not someone at Namco is a Roman Catholic, or just thinks that Roman Catholicism is interesting. But why in the world were these images removed from the Turbografx-16 version of the game? They could have just put another line in their outrageous parental warning on the box art.
Warning. This game contains Christian religious imagery and prayer. Play at your own risk, sinner.
It's odd to me that NEC would have been this worried about the use of religious imagery, especially when the religious imagery is plainly not intended to be offensive. The mask I can understand. Who wants to be sued? But removing the cross and the altar just makes this moment completely incomprehensible. They really should have left it in. Anyway, from here, Rick still has to fight some possessed furniture, then some dismembered arms, which are always a nice touch, and then you get to choose where you go from here, which adds a bit to the replayability of the game. Do you go up, or do you go down? Going down leads to another sewer-like level, which is kind of boring. But if you go up the ladder, there's a scrolling stage and an art gallery where you're intermittently attacked by a ghost girl that tries to drop skulls on your head. Very cool. Get past her and you can take a ladder back down where you face yet another scrolling area, though this time it's littered with zombies and a pumpkin-headed floaty guy. Knock the hat off of his head and you arrive at yet another fork in the road. Do you jump in a hole or take the ladder? If you go down, then there's a kennel full of monster dogs and more ghost girls dropping skulls on your head. But if you go up the ladder, you have to traverse the worm room. Gross, but kinda cool. Get to the end of either of these areas and there she is. You did it, you found your girlfriend. But then this happens. Yup, poor Rick has to fight his girlfriend who's been transformed into a hideous monster by whatever evil forces inhabit the Splatterhouse. Defeat her, and then sadly she dies in your arms, crumbling into ashes and dust. How's that for anticlimactic? Okay, so now the game gets even weirder. You have to smash all these monster fetus bubbles inside of a fleshy cavern until you get to a giant monster placenta from which they arise. Everyone seems to call this a heart, but I think it's a placenta. That just makes more sense to me. And so it's off to the final fight, which for all intents and purposes seems to take place in the fiery pits of hell? This level is incredibly short, and soon Rick is face to face with the final boss, a giant face-melty Marilyn Manson? The music in this section of the game is sick, and so is the boss fight, but it's also pretty short, and thus ends one of the best action games on the Turbografx-16. Splatterhouse for the Turbografx-16 is short, flawed, and unnecessarily censored. But it's also full of a shocking amount of variety and surprises, and remains a lot of fun to play even to this day. In conclusion,
I'll take it from here, Jamie. Splatterhouse gets a 4.5 out of 5 turbovolts, Jamie. The only thing keeping it from a nice fat 5 turbovolts was all the censorship, yeah. Anyway, we're glad you came to watch the videos. We expect to see you in the next episode. Yeah, it's turbo time!
So, does that address your concerns?
Absolutely, Bradley. Splatterhouse is full of graphic, green-blooded violence, horrifying images, and they removed Jesus. And I'm still going to buy it.
Really?
Between you and me, the last person who tried to take something that Jamie wants is missing a couple of fingers. I'm not saying no. Well, could you please ring it up?
Well, actually, it's 10:15. Technically, we're closed.
Wait, no!
Oh!